In 1939, Mr. Albert was only 16 when the war in Europe began. He was sitting home with his father one day and heard people discussing German attacks on Poland over the radio. At this time, Mr. Albert thought nothing of the war being so young.
I didn't worry about going into service until I was 18 and I had to register for the draft. And when I registered for the draft, I knew I was going to get drafted. So instead of being drafted, I enlisted in the Air Corps because I wanted to fly.
He found a sign outside of the Lebanon post office saying, "Be a sergeant in 6 weeks, join the Air Force, be an aerial gunner."
I didn't want to go into the Army because I didn't see myself as a foot soldier.
Where were you enlisted?
I enlisted in Lebanon. Went to the recruiting office, and 3 or 4 days later I was on my way up to Harrisburg. From Harrisburg to New Cumberland, which was the induction center. 4 or 5 days later I went from there to Miami Beach, Florida for basic training. And that was in about the beginning of December. The beginning of January I was already on my way out to Las Vegas, Nevada to go to gunnery school, just like the advertisement that lured me into it said it was.
He was rewarded his wings and was promoted to sergeant, just as the advertisement promised. He then was shipped off to Amarillo, Texas for aircraft maintenance and engine school.
From there to Salt Lake City, to which was in a reassignment base. From there I was assigned to my crew up in Moses Lake, Washington.
After meeting the people he would go into combat with, they were sent to many places to prepare for battle as a team. His crew was assigned to a B-17. This plane was nicknamed the Flying Fortress, and it carried Mr. Albert and his crew around to where combat would be. Mr. Albert was assigned to ball turret gunner in the beginning of their assembly, but that wouldn't be his position for long.
I was assigned originally as the ball turret gunner, but I was almost 6'2" at the time, and it was impossible for me to get in that thing and be comfortable.
One of his fellow members, Vernon Whalen, decided to trade places with Mr. Albert to make life easier. Mr. Paul Albert was now the crew's waist gunner.
It was very important that Mr. Albert stayed connected with his family throughout his tour.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
I wrote a lot of letters, and my mother wrote me a lot of letters, and she did a lot of praying.
One day, Mr. Albert's crew was told it was finally time to leave for the base of the 336th Squadron of the 95th Bomb Group of the U.S. 8th Air Force, Horham, England. Their living conditions were good. They had a clean bed and warm barracks. As the crew started to hear about the other men's missions, they began to doubt their decision. They all became very anxious for their first mission, but luckily it was a milk run.
It was an easy mission. We didn't see any German fighters to shoot at, which disappointed us because we were gung-ho, and we didn't get much flak bursting around us, so it was an easy mission.
One of the scariest moments during Mr. Albert's tour was when he and his crew had to crash land.
We were scheduled to go to Berlin on this mission. We actually went over the North Sea and we were going inland. And the mission was recalled because the weather forecast said that we would be unable to bomb the target because it would be obscured with cloud coverage. So we recalled. So that meant when we come back over the North Sea, we safetied the bombs and dropped them into the North Sea, which means they sank to the bottom. And then we came in over the land. Everything was souped in. So we were at 32,000 feet, which was the highest we ever had the airplane. And we found an opening in the cloud coverage, and we got in, and we found this emergency field. There was a B-24 cracked up on the long runway, and we went in on the short runway. And when we landed, when we touched down, at about 90 miles an hour, when we hit the end of the runway, we were still doing about 50 or 55. We nosed over into a ditch, and the plane caught on fire, nosed over. The bombardier and the navigator up front were sort of pinned inside. They were hurt pretty badly. The pilot and co-pilot got out and they drug them away from the plane. And when it was all over, the shells were firing off because of the heat, the fire, and you know, it was just a pile of molten metal when it was finished.
Mr. Albert's other missions were a combination of easy and demanding.
My most memorable mission is when we, towards the end of our tour of duty, we flew down along the coast of France, and in southern France we cut in, and we were delivering supplies to the French Marquis. The French Marquis were the people that were uprising against the Germans at the time. And we flew in there, and instead of bombs were these big canisters, and each one was dropped with a colored parachute. The colored parachute designating the contents of the unit: ammunition, guns, food, medical supplies, those types of things. And it was just a joyous thing to see, you know, not that there was any combat or shooting or anything like that. We could actually see, we dropped them at pretty low altitude, and we could see these French people coming out of the woods to gather this stuff up.
After completing his 35th mission in October of 1945, Mr. Albert was finished with his tour in Europe. The first thing Mr. Albert did when he returned home was found his mother, who was out buying produce.
That was a joyous moment. I actually came into Lebanon. It was maybe 9:30. The train came down from Harrisburg at 8th and Railroad Street. I walked out the 10th in Guilford. The huckster's truck was facing west. She was buying something from him. And I put my finger to my mouth to silence the huckster. And I snuck up behind her. I thought she was going to die of a heart attack when she turned around. She started crying. The huckster started crying, and I started crying. I'm not an extra religious person either, but I know my mother's prayers were answered.
Mr. Albert went back to work after returning home from the war, and he eventually went to school to become a teacher through the GI Bill. Throughout his tour, Mr. Albert received many medals, including the Distinguished Flying Cross, an Air Medal, a Victory Medal, an American Campaign Medal, and a Freedom Medal. Mr. Albert, we appreciate all you have done for your country. Thank you so much for your dedication and bravery.